What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm starting to get intensely fired up for the release of Quentin Tarantino's new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, on July 26th, and I thought it'd be fun to make a video on Tarantino focusing primarily on his love of movies rather than on his work as a filmmaker. He's been incredibly vocal over the years about his ever-changing list of favorite movies, but today's list is going to be kind of unusual because I'm going to be celebrating my top 10 favorite movies that I've seen Quentin Tarantino vigorously recommend and defend in the past. Now, there are plenty of filmmakers out there who have a deep love of film history, but Tarantino definitely takes that obsession to another level entirely. Long before he became successful, Tarantino worked for years as a video clerk at Video Archives in Manhattan Beach. And before that, he worked as an usher at the Pussycat Theater in Torrance Beach, but he said repeatedly that the porn movies exhibited there bored him to tears. But today, he owns his own movie theater in Los Angeles, the New Beverly Cinema, where they screen movies on 35mm, with many of these prints coming right from Tarantino's personal stash. Clearly, this guy is still deeply in love with movies, and you can feel that love in pretty much every single frame of his movies. I'm not arguing that a filmmaker has to be a maniac about watching old movies. Film history has plenty of great directors who avoided watching movies like The Plague, but as a movie buff myself, I've always enjoyed hearing the recommendations of cinephiles who make the jump to director. Francois Truffaut, Peter Bogdanovich, and Martin Scorsese are some other directors I like who are up there with Tarantino when it comes to being movie freaks transitioning to being great filmmakers. And maybe I'll do another video like this later this year when Scorsese's film The Irishman comes out. But for now, we're going to focus on Quentin Tarantino. As far as Tarantino's favorites are concerned, I'm using a variety of sources. Ever since his movie Reservoir Dogs took the world by storm, Tarantino has been more than happy to rant and rave about his favorite movies, and sometimes he does so in documentaries like Not Quite Hollywood or One Day Since Yesterday. He's also re-released and promoted a variety of his favorite films over the years, but the best sources are his lists that he's composed, like a famous handwritten note that he sent to Empire magazine in 2008, as well as the list that he wrote in response to the 2002 and 2012 Sight and Sound poll ranking the greatest movies of all time. And what you can see is how the movies on Tarantino's lists are always shifting around a bit. And I should add that in his most recent 2012 list, he chose instead to list all of his films alphabetically instead of numerically, except for the number one slot. But I'll also be pulling from his list of his top 20 favorite grindhouse movies, as well as his top 20 favorite spaghetti westerns, the last of which he wrote while shooting Inglourious Basterds. For the hardcore movie fans out there, I'll include a link to all these lists in the video notes below. But for now, without further delay, these are my top 10 favorite movies that have been enthusiastically suggested and endorsed in the past by the great Quentin Tarantino. So, number 10. A list of Tarantino favorites wouldn't be complete without at least one outrageous movie. Whether you're talking about the excesses of Blaxploitation or Italian Giallo, Tarantino has an encyclopedic knowledge of the kinds of movies which during these overly sensitive times make a lot of people clutch their pearls in outrage right before they reach for their pitchforks. So for this list, I've chosen one of the strangest movies I've ever seen from 1971, Pretty Maids All in a Row. A tale of a serial killer on the loose in what is probably the horniest high school ever depicted on film, one where the teachers seem to routinely cross every ethical line imaginable by having sex with their students. And when it comes to director Roger Vadim, the filmmaker who gave us Barbarella, Queen of the Galaxy, he's been called every dirty name imaginable, and it should come as no surprise that he'd be interested in directing this kind of material. But the big shocker is that it was written and produced by none other than Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. The only thing this movie has in common with Star Trek is a brief cameo by Scotty himself, Mr. James Doohan. But what's amazing is how this movie, one that would be absolutely shunned today, features actual movie stars, legends like Rock Hudson, Angie Dickinson, Telly Savalas, and Roddy McDowall. 1971 was overflowing with controversial films, movies like Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs, and The Devils. So if, like me, you missed the days when Hollywood embraced shocking material instead of condemning it, be sure to hunt down this flick, which I consider a genuine cultural oddity. Number 9. Next up, I'm going to go with Jack Hill's Blaxploitation masterpiece from 1973, Coffee, starring the great Pam Grier. I nearly went with Jack Hill's film Switchblade Sisters in that Tarantino re-released it as part of his Rolling Thunder video series, but Tarantino did specify Coffee as his number 9 favorite movie of all time back in 2002. And he placed Coffee at number 5 on his list of favorite grindhouse movies. But this is one of those movies that within the first few minutes grabs you by the throat and just refuses to let go. The music's killer, and at one point Pam Grier indulges in what is arguably the wildest catfight ever caught on screen when she takes on an entire room full of jealous prostitutes. If you love Tarantino's Jackie Brown, you owe it to yourself to see Coffee. This next movie is particularly important. Apart from being a ruthless revenge saga, the name also became the inspiration for Tarantino's short-lived distribution company, through which I saw so many great flicks for the first time, like Lucio Fulci's The Beyond and Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express. The movie I'm talking about is the 1977 grindhouse classic Rolling Thunder, starring William Devane and Tommy Lee Jones. The story deals with a Vietnam vet's decision to get some payback after his family's the victim of a brutal home invasion. There's a darkness at the heart of this film that's difficult for a lot of people to take, and if you notice some similarities to Taxi Driver, that's because Paul Schrader had a hand in the screenplay. Some might criticize the plot for having one too many similarities with Death Wish, but as far as I'm concerned, Rolling Thunder is one of the essential cult classics of the 1970s. For number 7, let's lighten things up with a completely different kind of movie, Peter Bogdanovich's absolutely delightful comedy, They All Laughed from 1981. This is one of those movies where it's difficult not to fall in love with each and every character in the movie. Ben Gazzara and John Ritter are particularly great. Also, I strongly urge everyone to hunt down director Bill Tech's documentary, One Day Since Yesterday, about the making of this movie, where you'll be treated to Tarantino talking at length about his love for this movie, one where he admits that he watched it so many times that he worried he might have accidentally ruined it for himself. And speaking for myself as someone who chose to make New York their permanent home a little over a decade ago, I regard this as one of the essential New York films. But continuing with the lighthearted movies, for my number 6 slot, we have a movie that Hollywood would be scared to death of making today, which from my point of view makes it all the more essential to be included. If filmmakers want to maintain their cultural relevance, they should be rushing toward this kind of movie, not away from it. But I'm not talking about some grisly, gruesome midnight movie. I'm talking about the 1976 kids movie classic, The Bad News Bears. If you're scratching your head over this choice, then you haven't seen it in quite some time. But every time I revisit the film, I'm completely blown away by the film's depiction of kids. More specifically, the way they speak and how they behave when adults aren't around. As pop culture guru Kevin Mars pointed out, Stand By Me was probably the last time we had a movie that depicted kids this honestly. And Walter Matthau turns in one of the best performances of his career as the kind of coach that once again Hollywood would never dare portray on the screen. But in 1976, this movie wasn't controversial, it wasn't edgy. This was rated PG, family-friendly entertainment. This is a true time capsule from a much wilder era, and in my opinion, Bad News Bears is easily one of the most gleefully entertaining movies on this entire list. Number 5. Of all the filmmakers mentioned on this list, I owe the biggest debt of gratitude to Tarantino for leading me to the discovery of the films of Sergio Corbucci. While Sergio Leone is the most famous director of spaghetti westerns, Corbucci was certainly the most vicious, and his body of work on this front is just awe-inspiring. Movies like the first Django, Minnesota Clay, The Great Silence, Compañeros, Navajo Joe, the list goes on and on. But arguably the strongest of all of his movies is the 1968 film The Mercenary, starring Franco Nero. The movie is worth watching alone just to see Nero constantly lighting matches on anything within reach, including the boot heels of hanged men, the teeth of potential adversaries, even the cleavage of the working girls he encounters. Also, if you're a fan of Kill Bill Volume 2, you'll immediately recognize the music from the coffin sequence as it was lifted directly from this film. On his list of favorite spaghetti westerns, Tarantino has 4 Sergio Corbucci movies, and you really can't go wrong with any of them. But if you've already watched Sergio Leone's westerns more times than you can count, you are definitely ready for some Sergio Corbucci. Number 4. Quentin Tarantino's love for the films of Brian De Palma is well documented, and deservedly so. De Palma is one of my favorite directors of the last 50 years, but what's interesting is seeing how early in Tarantino's career he seemed most attached to the movie Blowout, often mentioning it in the same breath as 2 of his other favorite movies, which I'll be getting to in a moment. But as time has passed, De Palma's adaptation of Stephen King's Carrie has replaced Blowout on all of Tarantino's lists, including Tarantino's most recent list from 2012. I'm inclined to agree. I love Blowout, but I've seen Carrie about 1,000 times. I love everything about it, from its crazed portrayal of high school to its hallucinatory use of split screen during Carrie's rampage, and best of all, Piper Laurie as Carrie's mother. There's a strong case to be made for this movie as one of the most raw, entertaining movies made in the entire decade of the 70s, which is my personal favorite decade of cinema. What's funny is how pretty much all these movies came out during the 70s, if not immediately before or after, but this leads me to my next pick for my number 3 choice from 1976, Taxi Driver. From the most casual movie fan to the most hardcore cinephile, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver is one of the best American movies ever made. Long before I lived in New York, I knew this city primarily in a cinematic context, and whenever I would visit, I would hear Bernard Herrmann's hauntingly beautiful score playing in the back of my mind wherever I went. Whether you're discussing Paul Schrader's brilliant screenplay, the incredible ensemble cast, Michael Chapman's sublime photography, every aspect of this film just screams masterpiece, and it just as easily could have occupied the number 1 slot on this list. But in the end, this is a list reflecting my personal taste, so I couldn't resist calling attention to some of my favorite westerns. So with that in mind, number 2, If you've ever listened to my podcast, Wrong Reel, you'll know that director Howard Hawks is on my personal Mount Rushmore of favorite filmmakers. On his 2008 list, Tarantino includes 2 films by Hawks, and I was very tempted to go with His Girl Friday, a crackling comedy that is justifiably praised for its fast-paced overlapping dialogue. But instead, I'm going to go with Rio Bravo, a Western that Tarantino has routinely included in his top 3 favorite movies throughout his life. It's a movie that he describes as having taught him many of his masculine values in the absence of a father as a young kid. And what I love is how on the surface, the movie appears so simple, but deceptively so. But upon multiple viewings, as you get used to the movie's rhythms and its style of storytelling, this is one of those movies that, like They All Laughed or Dazed and Confused, becomes the ultimate hangout movie where you watch it just to spend more time in the company of these characters. I've often described it as the best hangover cure caught on film, and not because so much of the movie deals with Dean Martin's character's severe drinking problem, but because for years, I would toss this flick in anytime I found myself utterly crippled from the previous evening's bad behavior. But of all of Howard Hawks' movies, Rio Bravo is the one that best expresses his interest in characters who are good at what they do, who are dependable, professional. I have no idea how many times I've seen this flick, but I know I'll never stop revisiting it until the day I die. And for number 1, the choice is simple. This is one of my all-time favorite movies, but more importantly, in 2002, 2008, and in 2012, Quentin Tarantino repeatedly called attention to it as his number 1 favorite movie of all time. It also occupies the number 1 slot on his list of favorite spaghetti westerns, and I'm of course talking about Sergio Leone's 1966 film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Tarantino's a total fanatic for Leone's movies. On his spaghetti western list, Leone's movies occupy 4 of the top 6 slots, and with good reason. In the hands of Leone, westerns become exercises in style and mood that can only be compared to grand opera. I'm always changing my mind about which of his movies is my personal favorite, but the reality is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the one that I revisit most frequently. I can't tell you how many family bonding sessions I've enjoyed watching this essential western. The final duel alone might be the most emotionally soaring sequence ever filmed by a human being, or at least that's how I feel until I revisit Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West and Once Upon a Time in America, both of which feature sequences that are right up there with the climax of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But the reason this is my number 1 pick is because when it comes to pure raw cinema and the essence of visual storytelling, this movie is what filmmaking is all about. So that's my list. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll find something you're excited to see. I'll definitely be returning to the subject of Tarantino in the weeks leading up to the release of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Luckily, I still have many movies to see that he's called attention to in the past, but what's inspiring to me is how in spite of having made so many great movies, Tarantino's still actively watching movies just as a fan. He recently gave a shout out to Thor Ragnarok as his favorite movie in the MCU, so even at 56 years of age and knocking at the door of retirement once he finishes whatever film he has planned next, he still finds a reason to get excited about the art form that he's devoted his entire life to celebrating. So whether you personally love or hate his films, hopefully we can all agree that his enthusiasm for the past, present, and future of movies is something that we can all celebrate. But can't thank you enough for watching my little rant on this topic. If you want to talk more about it, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrex or leave me a comment in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this list and want to see more lists like it in the future, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking the video. That's very helpful to me. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.